Today I'm making the Julia Marie's Daytime Sleeper pattern from the Smocking Horse Collection. Here I'm cutting out the pattern from a blue cotton fabric. I was asked about this pattern in a comment on a previous video. It's a smocked sleeper made with woven fabric. It is an older pattern. The date I found on it was 1989. And since I've never used this pattern before, I decided to try and follow the directions mostly. The first thing I noticed was that this used a lot of fabric. The size that I'm making here was, according to the pattern, newborn to 3 months. And it took almost 2 yards of material, and I still had to piece one of the bias pieces together. After cutting out the pieces, I serged the front edge of the 2 front pieces because the pattern originally called for them to be cut on the selvage edge, which I had chosen not to do. Then it was time to pleat the 2 front pieces and the back piece. So I pulled out my smocking pleater and ran each piece through one after the other, then cut the threads between the pieces. Now the edges of each of these pieces need to be flat, so I pulled the pleating threads out just past that point. And this was something that was marked on the pattern, and I mark it on my fabric by clipping a notch at the top of each piece. Then I tied off the threads and pulled the pieces to the size noted in the pattern. I evened out the pleats and blocked them with steam. Now it's time to smock. I used a geometric smocking plate, which I will link in the description. And my pleating was a little off. The rows were too high and too close to the raw edge, so I started on the 3rd row instead of the 2nd like I normally would. And my main focus during this was making sure that the smocking on the 2 front pieces were even and not like crooked or starting in different spots, because that would have been pretty obvious. And after finishing the first front piece, I realized I'd made a mistake. I run into a problem, and I'm not entirely sure that it's one that's totally fixable in that like I can't go back and undo it and redo it. It's going to have to be adjusted as I go. And that is when I pleated this up and I pulled out the pleating threads to the notch. On these 2 front pieces, I forgot that there's like 3 or 4 notches, and I was supposed to pull the pleating thread all the way out to the notch farthest from the front edge. And unfortunately, I didn't notice this until after I had already smocked one entire one. And even if I hadn't, the thing is that I can't just clip the threads and pull out further because they're already tied off to the proper size. Like, the smocked piece was supposed to measure, I think it was like 3.5 inches. So this is already pulled off to 3.5 inches. And if I was to pull it out to this notch, it would still need to be 3.5 inches. It would just be less fabric in that 3.5 inches. I think what I'm going to have to do is, because what all of these notches were for was to fold this edge under. So it would be folded once at the first notch, and then again at the 2nd notch to fold it under, like a double fold kind of thing. And I think on the top, I can get away with just folding it once and hopefully getting the right size at the top. And then kind of letting it work its way out at the bottom. So like if I fold it twice at the bottom and once at the top, and just kind of, I'll probably whip stitch this in place by hand anyway, kind of just let it work its way out and unfold by the top. And hopefully that will work. I'm going to have to do it on both of them because I made the same mistake on both pieces. So once all of the pieces were smocked, I blocked them again, then removed the pleating threads and cut the armholes out of the unpleated edge. I ironed strips of freezer paper onto the back of the smocked pieces, and this will hold the pleats in place when I sew over them later. Now I'm placing the front yolks with the right sides together and the body sandwiched in between, and sewing along the bottom edge of the yolk and the top edge of the body. For the back yolk, it's actually cut on the fold, so one half is the outer yolk and the other is the lining. So each yolk is folded in half, again right sides together with the body sandwiched inside and sewn. Now I'm sewing the pieces right sides together at the shoulder seams. I do this first for the outer yoke pieces and then twist it around so that the lining pieces are sewn separately. Then I basted the layers of the yoke together around the neckline and armholes. Now I didn't follow the directions for finishing the neckline. Why? Well, when I read the directions, I thought it was going to leave raw edges. But I just read over the directions again and realized that I actually missed a step when I was reading them because that last step was on the other side of the page. Here's what I did instead. I sewed the bias to the neckline, then trimmed down the seam allowance. I didn't measure it, but it was probably about 1/4 to 1/2 inch. Then I folded the bias over twice to cover the raw edge and pinned it in place so that I could hand sew it later. Onto the sleeves. I had to go back and recut the top of the sleeves because I cut the wrong view for what I wanted to do. The view I'm doing has pleats at the top. These are sewn with the wrong sides together and stop after a couple of inches. The 2 pleats in the back are pressed toward the back and the remaining 3 pressed toward the front. I then gathered the bottom of the sleeve to the width of the cuff and sewed them together with the cuff folded in half with the wrong sides together. Now, despite all of the pleats, the top of the sleeve still needed a gathering thread run to help ease the sleeve into the armhole before sewing them together. Then I folded the garment right sides together and sewed the side seams. Now the pattern actually called for using French seams to cover the raw edges, but I opted to serge the seams for simplicity. Now I'm overlapping the front left over the front right piece and basting them together at the bottom of the front placket. I took one of the inseam bias pieces and pressed it in half, then sewed it to the front inseam, trimmed the seam allowance down, clipped around the curves at the center, and stitched the seam to the bias. Then folded the bias to the wrong side of the fabric and pressed it. The back inseam, I sewed the bias, this time not folded in half, to the legs. Then I folded the bias over twice to cover the raw edge and sewed it. Now at the bottom of the legs there's a marking for placing elastic. I chose to attach it by sewing over elastic with a zigzag stitch while stretching it out. And this causes the fabric to gather while still being able to stretch. Now the pattern actually calls for the elastic to be cut to a specific size, which is what I originally did, but I found that my elastic wouldn't stretch to the full width of the leg like it needed to. So instead I just used it straight from the roll, stretched it as far as I could, sewed all the way across, and then cut the elastic. Now I flipped the sleeper inside out, line the inseams up, and sew at the edge of the placket starting at the foot and stopping about halfway up the leg. It's marked on the pattern for where to stop, and this is done on both legs. Now I'm running 2 gathering threads around the front of each foot. I then pinned each foot to the sole with the right sides together, using those gathering threads to even things out where needed, and carefully sewed around them. Now there are 2 more sole pieces. I took them and pressed the seam allowance to the wrong side of the fabric. I then took them and whip stitched them to the sole of the sleeper, sandwiching that seam inside it. I went ahead and sewed the neckline using a whip stitch. I then took the sleeve cuffs and turned them over the raw edge and whip stitched them as well. I sewed buttonholes to one side of the front opening and buttons to the opposite side, and then used metal snaps for the crotch opening. And for the front, they actually go through the placket as well as the main body of the sleeper, and that's what holds that placket in place and covers the raw edge. And here it is. It is really cute. I will say size-wise, it is definitely much closer to 3 months than newborn, at least in my experience with the sizing of most patterns. As I said, it does use up quite a lot of fabric, but it is nice to be able to make a sleeper style outfit without having to find knit fabric. Thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time for another handmade happening.